Well, thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity conservation, a subject related to ecology, not exactly the same thing. And I'm going to present a bit of a characterization of trends in conservation biology over the last 40 or 50 years or so. I'm going to try and draw out what are the sort of missing gaps, particularly those that most relate to ecology, genetics, evolution, and subjects that are of interest to the people here. So like many other subjects, and we've heard other people talking about this, there have been fads in conservation. The focus of the work, the framing of the questions has changed over time. And I'm going to try and characterize some of those trends over the past 50 years or so. And I'm going to try and do that thinking about what or who is conservation for. Now, interestingly, this seems a very obvious question. Everyone thinks they know what conservation is for. But when you start burrowing into a lot of writing about conservation, it's not entirely clear that everyone's talking about the same thing. And Bill Adams wrote a very fine book called Against Extinction, which the conclusion is basically we can all agree that we're against species extinction, but exactly what conservation is for is less clear. I'm going to focus a bit on what the major activities of these different framings of conservation are, and then I'll reflect on the science that underpins each one. Now, the reason that conservation has changed focus is because of changes in our understanding of pressures facing the world, trends in the way the world is changing, and particularly these have been the major drivers of changes in conceptions of what conservation is there for. So firstly, over the past 50 years or so, our much increased understanding of growing human populations, their footprint and their impact on the environment, and that impact then fed back onto people. Secondly, I think we've all known this all along, but it's become much better appreciated more broadly, that sustainable development, which is a right and a goal for society globally, is dependent on environmental goods and services. There's a non-negotiation about sustainable development's links to environmental goods and services. Thirdly, a lot of work that's gone on in the last few decades has really emphasized how severe the scale of biodiversity loss and ecosystem change is. I don't think back in the 60s and 70s we really understood the rate, extent, and nature of that change. And work that's been done more recently to measure it has shown that it is indeed a very serious problem. And finally, and perhaps most recently, we've come to appreciate much more broadly that human governance and human institutions need to be part of conservation responses. We can't have conservation practitioners on the one hand and the rest of society on the other. The two need to be linked together. So these are my four characterizations of how conservation has changed over maybe since about the 1960s. I think the first stages of conservation were really about nature for itself. And we wanted to save nature in its pure, pristine form, and that was the primary goal of it. Secondly, we moved into a phase probably in the 1980s, 1990s, which I'm calling nature despite people. So this was our understanding that human pressures were really becoming very severe, and that the main focus for conservation moved into addressing the drivers, the anthropogenic pressures on natural systems. The third stage, which I'm calling nature for people, really started around the turn of the millennium, around 2000, and this is a slight refocusing that nature is there to benefit people. It's there to support us. This is the ecosystem services framing of conservation primarily. And then more recently is the one that I'm calling people and nature, the linked people-nature system. This is the socio-ecological framing of conservation in these linked systems, people and nature working in concert for mutual support. So let me just go through these in a bit more detail. I'm going to use word clouds, which I dragged from key papers in each of these areas of work, just to give a feel for what this area of conservation is about. So nature for itself, the original nature conservation is primarily about species, protected areas. It's got quite a lot of wilderness in it. It's conserving areas. It's very much spatially based. And if you look at the way that we visualize this, it's about beautiful species, beautiful places, some nice remote areas of wilderness with natural wonders, and it really doesn't have any people in it. It all looks very nice, actually. The second one, the nature despite people, so now it all turns a bit more aggressive. This is about loss, invasives, diseases, pollutants, pathogens, the drivers of species decline. It's still very much a species framing. There are still protected areas and population biology in there, but it's about these pressures. And we think of it with these kind of ravaged landscapes, human depredation of various kinds, some ghastly things people have done to wildlife. And people do occur in here, usually doing something horrendous, often with a primate, quite often hanging off a stick. So that's the kind of nature despite people framing. The third one, nature for people, this is ecosystem services. This is conservation of biodiversity for people. And so here we have a lot more about values and economics. And actually, now we've moved away from species and into ecosystems. Ecosystems have become the main framing for this theme. So here we think about human-dominated landscapes where the natural systems are providing some support to people, flood control, a lot of focus on pollinators. They're a great poster child for ecosystem services. And this theme is also characterized by overcomplicated, multicolored diagrams like this, many of which I confess to having drawn myself. I didn't draw this one. People and nature, so this is the linked human socio-ecological system framing. So this here, we've even moved away from species and ecosystems. We're talking about resilience, vulnerability, adaptation, adaptability, and we've moved from direct consideration of the environment and nature and into people very much more strongly. Lots of thinking about change and dynamics. So here we have some nice-looking human-managed landscapes. We have people who are usually happy, and we have people holding hands, quite often dancing, that kind of thing. So you can see how those four stages have moved one from the other. And the point that I want to make in this talk is that as that's happened, the science has kind of moved along with them. There are different sorts of science disciplines that address each of these four areas. We move from the fundamental ecological studies, genetics, demography, protected areas, and nature for itself, and into this resilience and adaptation area of the socio-ecological systems of people and nature. And the profound change really has been a shift from preserving components of nature, particularly species and habitats, and the patterns that existed in the natural world, and into maintaining future form and function, adaptability and resilience. And there's a sort of discussion about the role of people in all this. I actually think that even nature for itself was primarily implicitly for people. People talk about intrinsic value of nature, but actually things were always being managed implicitly for people. Now the framing is explicitly for people, and it's for future people as well as the present day. So what I'm going to do is just review the science base that's underpinned this shift in these different framings. So nature for itself is really one that is dependent on studying populations, species, and habitats. It's an area that ecology is founded with. It's our core territory for ecologists. Nature, despite people, is much more shifted towards analysing the threats and drivers that are causing changes in natural areas, species, habitats, and so on. And so it immediately moved more into social science, into the motivations for change, and into the big global change drivers, from the direct drivers of hunting or habitat change to the indirect drivers to do with social and economic processes. Nature for people, the ecosystem services debate, then shifts to ecosystems, and it shifts to a primary focus on ecosystem functions and services. And then as we move into people and nature, this goes into these linked socio-ecological systems. So the point that I want to make is that as these trends in conservation have played out over the last several decades, so has some of the core science, particularly the science that feeds into the policy mechanisms. I think there's been science in all these boxes going on, but the policy, the focus of conservation has changed very fast, and sometimes it hasn't dragged the underpinning science along with it. So we've been following this trajectory primarily, and I want to focus a bit on the things that are in these boxes that aren't filled in, because ultimately populations and species and habitats underpin all this stuff. So I'm going to focus on 4 topics, which I've called here A, B, C, and D, that fill in these boxes, and just illustrate some of the science that's going on that I suggest ecologists need to pay more attention to in order to support the new framing around resilience and vulnerability and so on. So the first one is around the bringing together of nature and the drivers of change. So we know from many studies that threat and driving processes interact with different species and different systems in very many ways. So in the mammals, for example, we know that traits that are most strongly related to extinction risk vary across higher taxa and regionally. And that's because different threats focus on different sorts of species, because different species have different life histories and ecologies, and because in different parts of the world there are changes in the predominant drivers. So just mapping threats is going to miss some of this important differences in vulnerability. That isn't just a regional effect. Even at very small scales, it's clear that closely related species can respond very differently to the same environmental pressure. So this study by Nick Isaac and Guy Cowlishaw showed that even in one area where there are closely related primate species, some of them cope better with habitat degradation than others, and that's a significant difference. And finally, even the most general relationships, for example, that between body size and extinction vulnerability varies geographically to do with these different histories and different life histories and ecologies. So that's about the difference between traits and extinction pressures. There's also a difference between extinction pressures and the nature of the pressure itself. So this is some work that was done by a PhD student of mine, Martina Defonso, looking at different kinds of declines in the face of threat. So you can imagine that different sorts of pressures would lead to different trajectories of decline. So, for example, a constant proportional pressure, where the same number of individuals are removed from the population each year, perhaps because of some environmental change or some hunting quota or something, could lead to this sort of exponential decline, whereas a pressure where the pressure is increasing and is a fixed amount over time can lead to these precipitous declines. Now, if you're tracking conservation priorities, it's quite important that you know which one of these trajectories a species is on. It will alter which one you prioritize in the early years. And some work that we've done trying to link this to decline curves in the populations in the Living Planet report show that there are indeed connections between them, that the constant proportional pressures, for example, are very strongly associated with pollution as a threat, whereas the increasing fixed pressures are very strongly associated with disease as a threat. So priorities depend on the nature of the threatening process. A third important thing here is that we're very often using means of change and not thinking about the extremes of change, and failing to take account of the fact that most populations are fluctuating pretty wildly over time anyway. So these two small graphs are measures of the change in either abundance at the bottom or range area at the top for two large groups of species. The bottom ones are all the vertebrates in the Living Planet Index. The top one is all the galliforms in a major museum-based study of abundance patterns in galliforms. And the bar just gives you the change from one time period to the next over the last century. So these are decadal changes in abundance or range size for two periods during the 1900s. And the main point to observe is that most species are hanging around, going up or down a little bit between two time periods. The major changes in both the indices here are driven by these extreme declines at one end, at the left-hand end, and extreme increases at the right-hand end. And whether or not the overall LPI is going up or down is much more determined by those big increases and declines rather than by the details of what's going on in the middle, where populations are just fluctuating around. So I think we need to think a bit more about these dynamics of declines and not just taking averages across different areas or different threat types. In a related study, we looked at traits of mammals that are susceptible to extreme events. This is some work by Eric Amika Iwares, and looking at mammals that suffer from extreme events such as typhoons, hurricanes, and so on. And the traits that make species vulnerable to those are not the same as the traits that are generally associated with extinction risk. So as we move into this world in which there are more extreme events, we need to understand this a bit better. So that was the box that's called A. Now I'm going to move into nature for people, the ecosystem services framing. So again, we can't treat this independently of thinking about nature. Nature underpins ecosystem services and indeed the goods and benefits that we derive from ecosystems. This is a very complicated area because obviously ecosystem management affects both species and ecological communities that underpin those services, but also the services themselves. So I'm going to use the kind of framing that came out of the National Ecosystem Assessment, where there are a bunch of ecosystem functions, things like nutrient cycling, water cycling, production, and so on. And those underpin what are called ecosystem services, which are in the ecosystem. So these provide services from which people ultimately benefit: trees, carbon sequestration, and wild species diversity. And then, of course, as that moves into the wider economy, into society, the direct goods and benefits come from those: timber, an equitable climate, and nature appreciation. Now, the important thing is here that biodiversity conservation actually fits in multiple places in this framing. So it's not just in the benefits to people. Biodiversity is a regulator of ecosystem functions. It's an ecosystem service in itself in providing variety of, say, goods and so on. And it's also a benefit. We want to maintain ecosystems for the species that people value highly. And the conservation community have, I think, got very confused about whether biodiversity is an underpinning necessity for ecosystems or whether it's a benefit from good ecosystem management. And of course, it's both. But the conservation agenda mainly focuses on the right-hand end of this spectrum. It's mostly about species of birds and mammals. And it's not necessarily true that conserving those will necessarily conserve all the ecosystem functions at the left-hand end. Now, moving on to just thinking about the narrow sense diversity, that is the diversity of genes, species, and traits or functions that underpins ecosystem functions at that left-hand end. How does conservation of diversity fit in there? So this is a kind of meta-analysis or an informal balance of evidence analysis, actually, that came out of a paper that Brad Cardinali and colleagues put together last year. So this is surveying the literature for evidence that diversity in that specific sense of genes, species, and functions underpins some of these ecosystem services. So you can see there are provisioning services and regulating services on here. And if you just look at the right-hand column and the arrows there, if diversity contributes to stronger service provision, the arrow goes up. If it doesn't, the arrow goes down. And if there are mixed outcomes in the studies analysed, there are crossed over arrows. So you see, it's not entirely clear that more diversity always underpins ecosystem services. Sometimes it does. Many times for the provisioning services particularly, it doesn't necessarily. There's very mixed results for the biocontrol disease resistance area, which I think is not very well understood in this regard. For climate change, it probably does. For soil quality, it probably does. But it's not a completely clear picture. So then moving on to threats and drivers in ecosystem, threats, drivers and ecological studies for this ecosystem area, nature for people. I'm going to quickly revisit some of the work that Sandra Diaz talked about on Monday, just because I think this is a very nice way to bring together species level studies with their ecosystem consequences. So Sandra presented this as well. This is a kind of new framing that Sandra and Andy Piaz and Andy Purvis and colleagues published recently. So we have species, perhaps sitting on a phylogeny that are related. They possess traits which, of course, are a function not only of their genotype, but also the phenotype, the environmental effects. And those traits underpin effect functions, the way that species contribute to these environmental functions, production, decomposition, and so on. Different species have different effect functions as a result of their traits. But those species also have different response functions. They will respond differently to environmental pressures. And so the way that this plays out in a changing environment is that the environmental pressures can filter which species are there or how abundant those species are, and therefore feed back into the effect functions. There's this cycle as different species that have traits that make them more vulnerable to environmental change get stripped out of the system, and you're left with species that have different kind of effect functions. This is a really complicated system, but I think we have to understand this better if we're really going to be able to predict the effect of environmental change on ecosystem functions and services. Right, so now I'm going to move into the area I call D, and I can't cover all of this, but I want to focus particularly on some of the general discussion in this socio-ecological systems, which is around resilience, vulnerability, adaptability, socio-ecological systems. And I want to particularly focus on adaptability. This is a key issue in this kind of discourse on socio-ecological systems. So what does adaptability mean? Well, in some definitions, it's a function of the social environment. It's about people managing the system in order to be able to meet their needs. So the adaptability is about people and groups acting to manage the system to maintain whatever it is they want from it. In other framings, it's about this joint response, the linked social ecological system, and it's about that whole system keeping its properties in the face of changing drivers externally. IPCC actually talk about adaptability in terms of people being able to withstand pressures on climate change and so on from on food supply security from climate change. But of course, as ecologists, we know that adaptability is about microevolution and plasticity. And the point I want to make is these are very different uses of the word, and yet they're often thrown in together in the same sort of debate. So in species conservation, we're talking about adaptability as the ability of those species to survive and reproduce in a changing environment. And the mechanism is evolution and plasticity, and the constraints are to do with the rate of evolution, the costs of evolution, and the costs of phenotypic plasticity. But in social and human systems, the adaptability is of people, and the constraints are around social, institutional, and governance changes. And I think the two don't sit very comfortably next door to each other. I think there are some really hard questions about species adaptability and the functions of those species within ecosystems that may get lost when we focus only on social change. And that's what I want to come on to talk a bit about now, is to talk about measuring species vulnerability to climate change. And although I'm going to use climate change, I think a lot of this is true for other kinds of major threat processes as well. It's not just relevant to climate change. So it's really very simple for a species faced with some dramatically changing climate. There are 4 kinds of things that can be done in order to persist. You can disperse, it can just sit tight and cope with it, they can evolve to adapt to the new environment, or they can just go extinct, either locally or globally. And much of the work on climate change adaptation focuses primarily on dispersal. I think dispersal is another kind of coping or evolving. It just means doing it in a different place rather than the place that they are to start with. So these 2 major kinds of biological adaptation, coping through phenotypic plasticity and evolving through genetic change, are fundamentally different processes with different underpinning biology and different constraints that come from those processes. So for coping, there needs to be quite a lot of phenotypic variability, and there will be ultimately a limit when the physiological limits, for example, or some other hard limits are reached by the population. And it tends to be, as a very broad generalization, species that live in variable environments or have lots of genetic variability are likely to have more phenotypic plasticity than species that don't. So extent of change is more of a problem than rate of change. In contrast, evolution is an entirely different process that requires genetic variation and selection pressures, and it's going to be limited when the rates of change are very high, particularly for species with long turnover times. And it's relied on fitness being linked to environmental traits, which in a radically changing environment is not quite clear will always be the case. And here the rate of change is probably more important than the extent of change. So there are many studies that have just looked at climate change effect on species by overlaying maps of climate change, have, I think, missed some of these subtleties about the differences between species and ecological communities facing the same change. And the graph on the right there is an interesting small study of the small number of species for which local extinction or population declines or even extreme population variability has already been attributed to climate change impacts. And what you can see from that is that it's not the direct effect of climate that affects these species that are declining or going locally extinct. It's indirect effects. So it's not the extreme temperature or the desiccation stress or the loss of aquatic habitat. It's actually pathogens or reduction in the food supply or loss of microhabitat or loss of a symbiont. So it's these interactions in ecological communities are coming in before the direct impacts of climate change itself. So there's a very nice paper came out earlier this year from Ben Sheldon's group in Oxford, where they parameterized a very detailed linked evolution phenotypic plasticity model of Shevin et al. Using the very detailed studies from the great tit population in White Wood. So they were able, uniquely, I think, to parameterize that model because they've got so much historical information on the White Wood great tit population. And what they can then do is take they know the amount of phenotypic plasticity, they know the rate of evolution because they've got the heritability of the traits that are linked to climate change. And they can assess whether the amount of plasticity in that population will be able to cope with projected climate change for White Wood in Oxfordshire. So that's the graph on the left shows the extinction risk with the White Wood level of plasticity generalized for all bird species as if they lived in White Wood in Oxfordshire with the amount of climate change there. I know we don't care about White Wood in Oxfordshire, but we do care about all bird species. So along the bottom, you've got generation time, and on the left, you've got population growth rate. And for that population, with the amount of phenotypic plasticity there, there's a vanishingly small probability of it going extinct. You would only have it if there was very long generation times, very small population growth rates. But if you remove the phenotypic plasticity, so now you're just relying on evolutionary or very narrow levels of plasticity, then you see the graph becomes largely red. There's very high extinction risk. The only persisting ones are the ones with very high population growth rates, short generation times. And of course, species don't occupy that whole thing. They actually they mostly sit on that line that links the two. So that raises a very important question about how different species will respond. We really don't know. There are so few data sets like this that it's hard to tell. This paper actually got quite a lot of publicity, and I really like the way that the Los Angeles Times describes this study. So I think they're pretty much right, actually. It's just an unusual way to describe it. There are two main ways species can cope with a rising thermostat: by evolving or by being versatile. So that's pretty good. The former requires genetic changes in a short amount of time within a population. The latter, a concept biologists call phenotypic plasticity, involves adjusting to fit in, like a high school kid who can float in the nerd, jock, and goth crowds, whatever that means. For a bird, it means changing appearance or behavior to take advantage of a changing environment. Phenotypic plasticity by the Los Angeles Times. So in the white and wood population, it was possible to do that very elaborate study because of that huge history of data gathering and tracking environmental change and its impact on the population. That's not going to be true for many other species, but it doesn't mean that we can't think about doing this. And I want to just present some work that came from a study I did a few years ago with IUCN of trying to get a bit more subtlety into thinking about the impacts of climate change on species, contributing to the IUCN Red List, actually. So here, we took 3 measures of vulnerability to climate change. The exposure, that is the amount of climate change species were going to be exposed to. Their sensitivity, which we just scored according to their ecology, really. How likely were they to be affected by climate change? Maybe they've got a specialized habitat, low physiological tolerance. There was some environmental trigger that's likely to be disrupted by climate change, some specific interaction, or maybe they're just extremely rare. And then thirdly, what their adaptive capacity was, adapting either by dispersing or by evolving, looking at dispersal ability, generation time, reproductive output, and so on. So what we did was came up with a set of fairly systematic scoring system within each of these groups, within the birds, within the amphibians, and within the corals, and then asked sets of species experts in groups to score species for those traits. And obviously a lot of data underpinned it from the various trait distribution and climate change databases. So it's not comparable across groups, and it's really only a relative assessment within them. But we were able to gather data on almost all the species. And then the idea here is that the most vulnerable species to climate change is at the conjunction of those 3. They're species that are exposed to climate change, they're sensitive to it, and they have low adaptive capacity. They're not going to be able to cope. So it's kind of the purple bit in the middle of those 3 circles. But the other areas are interesting as well. So there are species that might be sensitive and have low adaptive capacity, but are not yet known to be exposed to climate change. We probably ought to know what those are in order to be able to react. There are species that will be exposed and sensitive, but we expect them to be able to take care of it themselves, either by dispersing or perhaps just because they should be able to evolve or adapt quickly. But again, you'd have to monitor that. So it's not only the central area that's of interest, it's some of the edgy bits as well. So here's the results of that mapped on the globe. And I'm sorry, the coral stuff doesn't project very well like this, so I'm going to mainly direct you to the bird and amphibian results. So these are plotted on these 2 axes. The yellower the color, the more species are exposed. The bluer the color, the more the species are sensitive or have low adaptive capacity. And when they're purple, they are exposed to climate change and they have low sensitivity and adaptability. So the purple areas are the ones that we worry about a lot. The graphs on the left are the proportion of species falling into that group. The graphs on the right is the number of species. So you can see some interesting things here. There are some purple areas, which are the areas that we most worry about. And actually, for both birds and amphibians, Amazonia and a lot of Central America falls into that category. Species that are vulnerable and they will be exposed to relatively high amounts of climate change compared to their background rates. But there are some slightly better bits of news as well. So there are areas where the species are sensitive and have low adaptive capacity, but actually the amount of climate change will be relatively low, the blue areas. And then there are areas where there will be a lot of climate change exposure, but actually the species there are expected to be relatively resilient to it. So I'm not suggesting that these are accurate representations. I think this simply enables us to go and, well, firstly prioritize the areas that certainly come out high, but also think about the precise sorts of conservation interventions for the categories in different parts of this diagram, the blue, the yellow, the red. What kind of monitoring, what kind of conservation actions are needed? So I'll move on to some conclusions. I'm firstly going to just draw some conclusions about adaptation. The science behind ecological adaptation and resilience seems to me to be a bit underdeveloped relative to demand. This framing around people linked into ecological systems is very important. I think it's going to be very influential. And I'm not sure we've got all the ecology, genetics, and evolution in there that we need, particularly as it scales up from individual species and populations into ecological communities and into ecosystem functions and so on. Both human, social, and biological adaptability are important, but they're different. And if we just focus on the social changes, we're going to miss some important bits of biology. And I think there will be good news and bad news in the interactions between people and ecological systems, but we have to think about the mechanism and not just the mapping of where they are. And so I'd suggest that there's much more important work yet to be done to bring ecology and genetics into this framing of what I've called the people and nature conservation approach. Secondly, just some conclusions about this focus on the purpose of conservation. So I think it's interesting, that progression of ideas that I talked about at the beginning. And whatever you think about the way that's gone, underpinning all of those is the idea that future demands from the environment will depend on nature. The biotic environment gives us natural capital from which all of the rest of life on Earth ultimately depends. And so we have to take care of nature itself. The context and needs in the future won't be the same as those today, just the same as if you looked 100 years ago and asked what kind of environment people needed then to support their livelihoods. So we shouldn't just focus on the needs of today to project the environment to the future. And so I do worry a bit that some of the framing around these rather utilitarian approaches to conservation may be too narrowly focused on today's uses and forget about nature itself and the broader contributions from ecological communities and ecosystems. Nature itself, in the original framing, really should not be forgotten in all this. And I'll finish with this really nice quote from Theodore Roosevelt, which I took on a plaque in the American Museum of Natural History, and I'm sorry I was leaning over when I took the photograph. The bit at the end, I think, it just summarizes what I've been trying to say. The nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation, increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Georgina, for that very, very stimulating talk. That's wonderful. Your nemesis is awaiting you here.
Yes.
But I've got to read these now, so that was really fantastic. I mean, putting the context of ecology in the conservation context is absolutely what we need. And to have a quote from a President of the United States to finish, well, you can't do better than that, so thank you. Right. You could have had a more up-to-date one.
I haven't got any better than that.
No, I'm afraid we haven't. That is absolutely true. Right. There are quite a few questions come in, as you would expect. It's a pretty stimulating topic. So here's a question from @JN Griffey. And the question is there still a place for old-school conservation parks without people?
Yes, good question. Yes, of course there is. And I think, actually, if I, take that final framing of people and nature, one of them is about nature in parks, protection. I think we need the full array of conservation approaches. There are some places and species that are only going to be able to persist where they're well protected. But we can't only do that. And so I'm not in any sense suggesting that we don't need that. I'm just suggesting that we need a much broader approach. We need that and more, actually.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, you'll probably recognise this one. It's @EntoProf, but if you don't recognise the Twitter name, you'll probably recognise the question. It is, how relevant and representative are studies that are essentially dealing with less than 3% of biodiversity, i.e. vertebrates?
Yes, so @EntoProf regularly asks me this question. Simon Leather. I know who you are. And of course, it's absolutely right, and I have publicly suggested that, yeah, it's a fair cop. We do study these things in mammals and birds probably too much, but that's the history of conservation, and I'm just waiting for the entomologists in their many forms and the invertebrate specialists in their even greater forms to catch up and get some of the data sets together that allow you to do this. But actually, if you look at the framing of the ecosystem services argument that I talked about, so going through from these underpinning functions into the benefits that are sitting within ecosystems, in those areas, plants and invertebrates absolutely overwhelm all the vertebrates in terms of their contribution to those functions and services. So plants and invertebrates win out on being useful, even if they don't win out in the analyses that I've talked about.
Thank you. One final one then, all we have time for, I think, from @Carly Zita. I hope I pronounced it right. Lots of terminology here. Are ecologists speaking a different language from conservation practitioners, and if so, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, so I think that is a problem, and actually that's why I focused on adaptability, because I think adaptability has become used in probably too many ways for its own good. It's interesting as well. So Nancy Grimm talks about this a bit yesterday, but resilience is similar. We have a different understanding of resilience in ecology than some of the human social literature, and then again than engineers do. So resilience, for example, for engineers is how much do you pressure it before it breaks, whereas for ecologists is if you push it out of its system, how well will it recover from that? Now, those are not trivial differences, and yet you could be having a discussion about resilience and not realize you were talking about two different things. So we do have a real problem sometimes about communicating across these different disciplines. And I think there are two things that's going to solve that. One is increasingly people working in cross-disciplinary groups, in bigger consortia, addressing bigger projects where you actually have to develop a shared understanding of the terminology. And if I'm going to defend these conceptual frameworks that I poked fun at, but actually which I've done a lot of myself, I think that's where conceptual frameworks are really useful. They're really important for helping groups of people with different backgrounds to get a shared understanding of their assumptions, about their definitions, about the processes that they think are driving change, and to focus the research questions properly. So I think it is a problem, but there is a way that it can be solved and is increasingly being solved in bigger interdisciplinary teams.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Georgina. I think